Welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a truly fascinating one for you. We're looking at a legal battle, but we're throwing out the traditional legal playbook. Instead, we're putting the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan under the microscope of psychodynamic psychology. And honestly, when you look at a rigid legal system through a clinical lens, the insights you uncover are absolutely wild.
So think about this. Is a trial just a cold, hard presentation of facts, or is it actually a massive, invisible clash of unconscious minds? That's the big question we're tackling today. We're going to impartially unpack our source material's clinical assessment of this deeply complex situation. We aren't here to take political sides or argue legal technicalities. Instead, we're diving straight into the unseen psychological forces that were driving everyone involved.
We've got a packed roadmap for you today. We'll set up the timeline and our clinical framework, break down the psychological defenses of both the defendant and the institution, look at what happens when those two unconscious motives crash into each other, and wrap up with how the human mind creates meaning out of trauma. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with the core timeline and the psychological framework we'll be using.
Okay, so here are the objective facts, the groundwork of the whole event. Between 2019 and 2022, Dr. Chen Jinyuan, who is a highly educated scholar, used a VPN to retweet some posts on Twitter. Then, in September 2022, he gets arrested in Kunming for picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Fast forward to April 2023, and he's sentenced to 1 year and 8 months in prison. After the verdict comes down, Dr. Chen pens this incredibly dense 20,000-word letter of defense from his cell. Now, standard legal analysis stops there, but our psychodynamic sources, they treat this timeline not just as a sequence of legal steps, but as the outward symptoms of a gripping psychological thriller. Which brings us to the lens we're using today, dynamic psychology, or psychodynamics. Think of it as a framework that looks at how our unconscious motives, our hidden inner conflicts, and our defense mechanisms shape everything we do. And not just individual behavior, but the behavior of entire institutions. So remember, we're not debating politics. We're asking, how did deep, unconscious psychological defenses literally dictate the actions of both the man and the system?
Moving on to how the defendant actually coped with this immense trauma.
Our sources point out that Dr. Chen has what clinicians call a highly integrated ego structure. Basically, when he was hit with the massive trauma of being arrested and locked up, he didn't emotionally unravel. Instead, he deployed these incredibly mature defense mechanisms. He used intellectualization, meaning he processed the entire traumatic experience through pure logic. He used sublimation, channeling all that raw fear and anger into intense academic output. He engaged in deep meaning-making, literally framing his legal battle using scientific theories. And he relied on epistemic humility, falling back on philosophical skepticism to handle the accusations. He basically used his core identity as a scholar as a shield to keep his mind intact.
There's a quote from the clinical assessment that totally blew my mind. It says, through complex network theories and Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the defendant transformed emotional pain into abstract theoretical problems, showcasing an advanced defense mechanism. I mean, wow, right? Instead of lashing out or breaking down, he built a fortress out of complex math and science models. He successfully isolated his ego from the threat of a total psychological collapse by retreating into the safety of pure abstract logic.
But what happens when we flip the script and analyze the institution itself?
You see, large institutions act like a collective mind, complete with their own psychological structures. And according to the analysis, the judicial system relied on much more primitive defense mechanisms, mostly driven by profound anxiety. The system experiences institutional anxiety, basically a terror of uncertainty and losing control. To deal with that, it uses projective attribution, projecting its own internal instability onto the defendant. It demands over-certainty, slapping definitive, rigid labels on things just to calm its own collective nerves. It relies on splitting, which is simplifying highly complex human behaviors into binary black and white threats. And finally, authoritarian self-protection, where it flat-out rejects any challenge just to keep its own internal reality from shattering.
To really put that into perspective, look at the legal concept of knowing in this case. The court's argument was that because Dr. Chen is so highly educated, he legally knew the posts he retweeted were false. But the psychodynamic analysis, it totally flips this on its head. It views his knowing not as an objective fact, but as a textbook psychological projection. The system is essentially taking its own deep anxiety about a messy, complex digital world and projecting it directly onto him. So what the institution calls a cold, hard legal fact, the clinical framework sees as an unconscious projection of the system's own fear. Now let's see what happens when these two totally different psychological systems crash into each other.
It's literally like mixing oil and water. The incompatibility is just staggering. On one side, you have the individual, an open, highly integrated ego, completely comfortable with uncertainty, driven by a pursuit of truth. And on the other side, the institution, a rigid, superego-like authority that demands absolute certainty, relies on projection, and is driven entirely by a core need for order and control.
Because of this massive disconnect, you get this incredibly dangerous psychological feedback loop. First, the anxious system projects its fear onto the defendant. In response, the defendant does what he does best. He uses his mature intellectual defenses to rationally fight back. But here's the catch. The system simply cannot process that complexity. It looks at his intellect, perceives it as even more rebellion, and responds by tightening its control. So ironically, the defendant's completely rational defense is exactly what unconsciously triggers the institution's deepest, darkest fears of losing control.
Our sources describe this as a tragic comorbidity, and it really is heartbreaking. The individual absolutely has to resist to maintain his sanity and keep his ego from fragmenting. But at the exact same time, the system absolutely has to punish him to maintain its authority and soothe its own anxiety. Both sides are trapped in an unconscious script they can't escape. They're pushing the conflict to the absolute extreme, and the real tragedy is they are literally incapable of communicating with each other.
Which brings us to our final section: how the mind attempts to repair itself after profound institutional trauma. Remember that massive 20,000-word letter Dr. Chen wrote from prison? The clinical analysis gives us a totally different read on it. They note, the 20,000-word prison letter is not just a legal appeal, it is a vital psychological self-repair mechanism used to prevent ego fragmentation under extreme stress. The meta-narrative here is just incredible. Writing that highly dense academic document wasn't just about the law. It was Dr. Chen's way of desperately holding on to his agency. He was actively forging historical meaning out of his own confinement. By elevating his personal suffering and framing it as a symptom of a larger civilizational fault line, he essentially built a psychological sanctuary out of pure logic. He completely reframes reality. He's no longer just a helpless prisoner, he becomes a scholar studying a broken system. This meaning-making process is a brilliant testament to the resilience of the human mind. It shows how someone can take a position of absolute physical powerlessness and transform it into the powerful role of a historical witness.
And that leaves us with one final, profound question. When fear drives control and intellect drives resistance, can true justice even exist without psychological awareness? It's definitely something to chew on. This entire case shows us that until we pull back the curtain and recognize these invisible, unconscious drives, both inside ourselves and within the massive institutions that govern us, we're going to stay trapped in these tragic cycles of projection and conflict. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the forces beneath the surface.